topic number one, which actually, as you can probably imagine, happens to be my favorite. Building the right finance team at the right time. Aarish, would be great to understand from you, I guess, a little bit about, your thoughts around this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough one. So obviously, we primarily work with companies that also already received relatively significant funding, sort of 7 figures. But I always kind of split this up into kind of 2 different areas, right? So finance operations versus strategic finance. And what I tend to say is, the very early stages of pre-seed and so on, you really don't need anyone in finance. You can pretty much get away with having an external accountant and maybe a bookkeeper, but even then doesn't really need to be a full-time head there. You could use an executive assistant or whatever. But as you start scaling, what we tend to find is when we come in as fractional CFOs, the biggest problem that we initially face is if the basic hygiene is not in place. And what that typically suggests is you've got an accountant who doesn't really necessarily know what they should be doing for this particular business. Their job is to get your stats done, your VAT, your tax, and so on, and that's what they're incentivized over. So often at that kind of post-seed stage, getting someone, a decent bookkeeper, maybe a management accountant, or a sort of finance manager level person is really valuable because it just makes sure that basic hygiene is in place. And obviously, as you scale, you start growing that team. You may add in a management accountant or financial controller over time. And then by the time we kind of tap out of most of our clients, which is, post series A, B, by that stage, you should really be looking at a more full-time head in the CFO role. And then again, if you think about what I was just saying earlier in terms of splitting out into finance operations versus strategic finance, that whole kind of bookkeeping, management accounting, control function very much within the finance operations. So that's the kind of BAU in the business work. And then on the strategic side, which is FP&A, CFO, etc., that's often looking outside the business and strategically forward. But what I always say on top of anything else is there is no hard and fast rule that makes sense for all businesses. I think, depending on what your business does, how transaction heavy it is, you may want to lean, more towards a kind of finance ops side. If on the other hand, you are a fast growth scaling business that is either raising lots of capital or working with lots of customers or doing some interesting stuff, and obviously having a good strategic finance kind of division within the business is really important. Joe works with, I guess, a lot more. He's shaking his head there, so he's obviously already disagreeing with me. Joe works with a lot of businesses that are kind of post pre-seed, if I can put it that way, onwards. So he almost certainly has a different take. Well, he would do if he hadn't disappeared off the screen there. But yeah, Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the hiring process of startups and scale-ups is really important to get right. Having gone through the whole range from pre-seed all the way up to Series A and post, and given the changes in the market with the availability of staff, my advice in most of these circumstances, quite a few CFOs and head of finance and FDs on this call as well, is to really overhire if you can. One of the best things I've done recently for a company that I'm in was to move a particular salary range from 75 to 105 when looking to recruit an FC, and we actually went for a head of finance in the end that proved, massive dividends in a company that was scaling quite quickly from, 6 million to 15 million ARR in the space of about 6 months. And that growth was unexpected when we went through the hiring process.
What I would kind of add to it is obviously everything is always budget dependent, right? So if you've got the bandwidth to be able to lift salary, then great. I mean, reality is with most startups, most scale-ups, finance is often the most under-resourced and overstretched department of any business, right? So you've got to be able to make the case for why finance is a valuable asset to the business. And that's not just about reporting, that's about driving, whether it's top line by making sure the quality of the revenue you've got coming in is good, whether that's optimizing your unit economics, your margins, etc., whether that's cost control, whether that is reporting and or forecasting, right? Like you've got to make the business case why finance is super important. And the reality is lots of founders that we have worked with in the past under-optimize finance because it's seen as a cost. It's not that important. It's not driving the business forward. But the reality is, like, a really great finance function can have massive impact. So what I would say is, if you have the budget, you want to hire the right people. Like, the worst thing you can do is hire average team members in finance, because the impact and the knock-on effects of that throughout the business can be really quite profound. So I would agree with Joe that, like, you want to hire at the at the highest band you're able to, but that's within the constraints of what you have to manage. And let's face it, right? When you've got the choice, or when a founder has a choice between hiring, a top engineer at 150K versus, and that means that they've got to drop 20K off a finance team member's salary expectations, like, they're going to go for the engineer. So you've really got to be able to make that business case. But where I would 100% agree with Joe, exactly as I just said, like, finance can have such a profound impact on the business that you do want to make sure you're hiring the best quality you can afford.
Yeah, I think we often sort of see both points, to be fair, so we would always advise, that you probably do want to sort of overhire where you can in finance, just forward thinking about where the business is going to be in the next sort of 6, 9, 12 months time, as opposed to sort of hiring where it is at the moment, because then depending on the level and the experience of person, sort of ultimately just sort of supports how they are able to scale with the business in sort of X time frame. I think what I've found, which has been really interesting since we launched the US business in January, is just the differences in how UK and US companies hire for finance, in terms of like the speed at which they bring in the generalists, or at which point because in the US I found that businesses will start to hire specialists earlier on than the UK, whereas they would look to have that sort of generalist for a longer period of time, which has been really interesting. So typically, is there like a role or level of experience that you would hire?
Yeah, well, let me put it this way, right? Joe was one of the first people who came in to work with us at Emerge One. And the reason that, that I wanted Joe to work with us is because he was, I think on his CV, he was like a group controller level, but he clearly wasn't, right? He had the skill set way above that. So what I would say is, like, always hire for attitude as much as aptitude. So it's one thing to hire for someone who has the right qualifications, the right experience, but what you want to be digging into is, do they have, Joe's going to hate me for saying this, but do they have the growth mindset that they're going to be able to actually go beyond what they do today? Are they curious? Are they intellectually sort of looking at how they can improve? So in a startup especially, you don't want people who are just, you need some people that are just there to kind of tick over and get the job done. But especially in finance, which again, as I say, is often so under-resourced, you want to have people who are able to, look around the corner and actually be proactive about how they approach finance. You don't want someone who is, going to do the kind of data chasing at the end of the month. You want someone who's figuring out, how can we ensure that we have to do less data chasing, down the track? How do we make sure that we can manage our suppliers and our vendors in an efficient way? And also, how can we ensure that, we are forecasting and budgeting in the right manner? And if you've just got someone who's kind of just ticked the boxes around, past first time and, has worked in Big Four and et cetera, you're probably not going to find the right sort of person. So I would always say, like, absolutely hire for attitude as much as aptitude, or even over aptitude. But again, it always will come down to, what can the business afford, and who's willing to take, from the talent side, who is willing to take the risk of working with an early stage business or a startup or a scale up, because let's face it, finance people don't necessarily tend to be the most, tend to be slightly risk averse, I guess. And therefore working with startups and scale ups can be quite distressing to a number of finance people, because you just don't have that stability. But I think, as long as you know where the gaps are that need to be filled, and you find someone that is competent enough but with the right attitude to take things forward, I think you'll always do well. And like, one of my mantras in life very much is, hire slow, fire fast, right? And what I mean by that is take your time over the hiring process, make sure you're getting the right person in, because it will cost you a hell of a lot less to take an additional 1, 2, 3 months to get the right person than it is to get the wrong person, have to unravel that, right? And so if you do have the wrong person, make sure that you move them on quickly, and that you find a suitable replacement, because otherwise, both the actual kind of pound or dollar cost, as well as the kind of cost to the business, just in terms of processes broken, or systems not working, or people just not getting stuff done, far outweighs the benefit of keeping someone on for an extra 1 or 2 months. And by the way, that's across all levels. That's not just junior, that's junior and senior.
A question that we constantly being asked, are there any particular milestones which typically sort of trigger a hire, whether it's to an earlier stage business or more of a scale up venture? Is there anything specific you particularly look out for and think, right, this is the moment we need to kick off?
Do I have cash? That's essentially the argument always, right? No, and Joe will have some other views on this, I'm sure. But just for me, do I have the balance sheet that can allow me to hire in the people? And the second thing is, are we generating and scaling revenue, right? Because that's where finance is most important, is when you have either transactions or cash flows that warrant or need bringing in someone very, very quickly. So it's typically, are we at an inflection point where that revenue is growing, and do we have the balance sheet to be able to bring someone on? But Joe may well have, with other businesses, there may be other sort of specific pain points that warrant bringing someone in.
Yeah, I think I might look at it slightly differently in that, for me, it's about acting on the best behalf of the company, right? And whether they're getting value for money. If I'm doing things that should be done by somebody that's cheaper and they're paying an expensive rate, right? Sure. And those things are being done for a day a week or even more, then it's absolutely the right time to be looking at other less permanent, semi-permanent resource to do those things. And equally, if I in a full-time position as well, if I'm spending a lot of my time doing things that aren't adding value to the business, right, then I'm not not worth the pounds that somebody's paying me. So for me, it's really about thinking about the business more so than the role.
Yeah, I 100% back that up. I mean, we will turn down pre-seed founders that come to us asking for CFO support, because we just know that they don't need it, and it would be a waste of their money. And equally, when we've gone in, we've had this with a number of clients we've worked in, right? Joe may have gone in, there's been a piece of work that they thought needed being done, and maybe it did need to be done, but actually, once that piece of work was done, whether it's a systems implementation or something else, they can then backfill that with the appropriate resource to then carry that on. Because why should you pay like a ridiculously high, well, I say ridiculously high, a relatively high day rate, for someone who's doing management accounting, for example, right? Like, which is often what happens when we come in as CFOs. There is this assumption that we're going to do, maybe the bookkeeping or maybe the VAT returns or the payroll, and that's just not the reality, right? So yeah, 100% agree with Joe that we will always work on in the best interest of the business, and if the best interest is that it's not us that they're working with, it's someone else, then that's fine.
Is there any method that you have around sort of the number of people within the finance team, whether there's a split between perm or fractional, or is there any views around that?
For the most part, if it's finance operations, you want them to be permanent. If it's strategic, you can get away with fractional, certainly at the CFO level for a while, because there just isn't enough ongoing repetitive sort of work that needs to be done by a CFO at those earlier stages. And by earlier, I mean all the way up to Series B. We have, for example, fractional FinOps kind of people within our team. Those tend to be bridges, right? Waiting until the business has, either as an interim function whilst the business is hiring, or bridging till they raise enough cash that they can go out and hire a permanent person. So yeah, from my perspective, fractional doesn't work in the finance operations side, because you need people that are available, day in, day out, because things break constantly potentially. So So yeah, I would always look for the majority of finance roles full time, certainly in fast growth businesses. And I think the fractional CFO is a very, very specific and different role to kind of the traditional finance function.
I would probably agree with that as well. From a risk mitigation perspective of the business, you tend to have more control and build better relationships with those people that are employed directly. Even if it's only 15, 20 hours a week for FinOps services, they're more likely to stay for longer and have loyalty if they're working for the company directly. So you have slightly more control over that.